Hi everyone, my name is James. Welcome to King's Find Woodworking. Today is going to be lesson 4 in our 16-week free online woodworking course. And it's time for us to get into a project. We're going to start with a project that everybody needs. This is a workbench, and it has some drawers in it, so it might look a little bit complicated, but it can even be built without the drawers. And I'm going to show you step by step how to do the whole thing, and you'll find at the end that it's actually a very easy project and a great beginner project. We are going to start by cutting the legs. I went down to my local big box store and I bought 4x4s for the legs. That's the easiest thing to do. Certainly they don't need to be 4x4, but rather than take the time to cut them down to smaller, we're just going to go ahead and use them at full thickness. I am taking the time to cut around the big knots and the big chunk outs that appear naturally in this wood. So the first 3 videos really talked about where to get your wood, the types of adhesives that are a good idea to use, and the types of tools that we use. And rather than cover a bunch of techniques individually, I thought it best to go ahead and jump right into a project, and I'll just kind of describe the techniques that we use as we go along. So here I'm cutting the rails, and not everybody is going to have a miter station with a stop that they can use to set up to cut the rails, and that's really no big deal. The rails can just be measured one at a time with your tape measure, put a pencil mark, and then cut them on the chop saw. Down the road, you might find it convenient, if you do a lot of woodworking, to get into building yourself a miter station. It's handy to have these flip stops. This flip stop is something that you can lift up out of the way just by pushing the wood up to it, and you can cut the end of the wood off square on the other side. Then what I'll do is I will flip the board around, and I'll lower my stop back in place, and I'll slide the edge of my board up to it, and then I'll cross cut it on the other side, and now I know I have square edges on both sides. Next we're going to cut the short rails, and when we cut off the edges of the boards to square them up, we want to make sure we cut back far enough to get rid of some of those cracks or checks that are at the end. My daughter Maya is cutting this board for me, and you see we've got a stop on the other side to locate the length of our short rails. So for this particular work table, I actually want the upper rails to be a little bit narrower than the lower rails, and we'll kind of get into that as we go along. But in order to do that, I am going to rip them in half here. It is best if you have a table saw for projects like this, although it's not required. A lot of things that we do here can be done with just a circular saw. The table saw does make them a little easier, makes them a little bit more accurate, and makes things go a little bit faster. But the tool I'm using to push this through with is called a gripper. And this is a very good tool to have. It's good for safety. It keeps your hands far away from the blade. And I should probably mention that I am actually teaching a friend of mine how to do woodworking at the same time, and as it turns out, this bench is for him, for his garage shop that he's putting together. My buddy's name is Mike. He's a firefighter, and if you've watched some of our other videos, you might have seen him helping me out in a few of them, and he's just sort of getting into woodworking. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and put together one of the leg assemblies. I'm using my blue framing square to align the legs to keep them square with the build. And then I'm going to use my red woodpecker square to make sure that the rail is flush with the side and the top of the leg. Next I'm going to use a countersink bit in order to pre-drill a hole for the screw to go in. This is going to ensure that the wood doesn't split when I drive the screw in. All of the specific tools that I'm using to build this project, I'm going to put in the description below. I'll put a link to them in case there's anything that you need or you might be interested in. Now I'm simply repeating the process on the other side. I want to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. This project and many others actually were requested by my Patreon supporters, and a lot of the projects that I build, actually I just take requests either from our community page on Facebook or directly from our Patreon supporters, and without you guys we wouldn't really have a channel, so thank you very much. Okay, so we've turned the project around and I'm going to install the lower rail. The lower rail is actually the wider rail, and I've got a pair of 2x4s there because I am just simply using the bottom one as a spacer because I want the rail to be about 3.5 inches up off the ground. I thought that would look nice. And other than that, we're really using the same set of techniques. I'm going to use the square here to make sure that I get it flush with the edge of my leg. Now I want to show you another technique that I'm going to use. So these legs are under a little bit of tension. They're wanting to move out of the way as soon as I take the drill out of the hole. So I'm going to go ahead and put this drill bit in, sink it, and I'm going to leave that drill in place to kind of hold it in the position that I want while I put the screw in the other side. Then I can remove the drill bit and put a screw in this side. So having the drill bit in the hole temporarily sort of kind of held everything in position for me, so there was no shifting. With both leg assemblies done, we're going to go ahead and put the whole structure together. My daughter Sai is going to help me there. And I've moved back to the top of the table. The top is the one with the narrow rail. And we're going to line this up like we did down below and assemble this portion. Once I get it in the correct position or really close, I'm going to go ahead and put a squeeze clamp on it to kind of hold it in place. Then I'm going to check it with my square, make sure that's correct, and make sure the top's correct, and I'll check all the way across, and it is. Everything's nice and flush. And so at this point, we can go ahead and pre-drill some holes in order to put some screws in. A lot of times our clamp is going to be blocking the location for one of the holes, and that's fine. You put the first one in, and then we can move the clamp and put the second one in. Then we're just going to move over to the other side and do the exact same thing. So once both sides are done, we're going to go ahead and stand this up and put in the lower rail. And I wanted to mention that since this is part of our 16-week free online woodworking course, I will have a comprehensive set of plans on exactly how to build this, and there'll be no charge. They're going to be on my website, and you can just go there and download them in case you want to build this exact project. And I'll put a link to the plans in the video description below. And if you noticed, my daughter has some 2x4 blocks underneath this rail to get it up to the same height as the other rail. At this rate, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to go through the same set of procedures that we did on the top. We're going to pre-drill some holes and insert some screws. Once again, the clamp is sort of in the way of getting the second hole in place, so we'll put the first one, put a screw, take the clamp off, and then put the second one. I wanted to mention that even though the video is very detailed and it should be pretty straightforward to build once you have the video and the plans, that a lot of people would be interested in possibly modifying this table, making it bigger or making it smaller or just various things like that. And we have a community group on Facebook. It's called the Kings Fine Woodworking Community, and I'll put a link to that in the description. We've got several thousand members in the community. It's actually a closed group, so nobody's allowed in the group except woodworkers. It's a very friendly group, very helpful group, and there are woodworkers of every skill level. And the sole focus of the group is to post pictures of your work and get help, and also to show off the work that you've done. And like I said, we have woodworkers of every skill level from beginning to intermediate to expert, and no matter what your question is, if you post a question in the group, you'll get help. It's kind of a place where everybody helps everybody, and I'm on there every day, and I answer thousands of questions a month on that group. So you're more than welcome to join the group, and like I said, I'll have a link to that in the description below. You may have noticed that I'm not building this table on an assembly table. An assembly table is something that has a nice flat surface in order to construct things on, but a lot of people will be building this project for the first time without an assembly table, and then in the future they might be able to assemble and build things on top of this. And when that happens in a new shop, you should just try to build it on a fairly flat surface. For a lot of people, that may be your table saw and outfeed, or you may have a particularly flat section of your garage or your basement, wherever you're working. Try to keep it flat, and then as you rotate the piece around and put the legs and everything together, you'll end up with a relatively flat and square structure in the end. So Maya and my buddy Mike are doing a good job of wrapping up the rails, and now it's time to move on to the braces. I'm going to put some like cross-structural support in between the rails so that he can put a ton of stuff on the shelf down below. What we do here is I put one screw in. I've marked the location. I put one screw at the top, and then I like to square this intermediate cross support vertically up and down, and then put the second screw in. I basically just got this like kind of centered here. And here I'm explaining to Mike exactly what I did. I used my mark, I put the wood center of the mark, and then I flushed it with the top and put the first screw in. And once I got the top screw in, then leveled it this way so I get the bottom screw in. And then in order to keep everything square with the project, I have one side in, so I'm going to go ahead and use my square in here to make sure I'm square between the front and back. And I'll just put a square in here to check that. And of course, it will also need to be flush with the top of the rail on the back side. And now Mike is repeating the same procedure on the next structural support over. Once that's done, we're going to rotate the table around and put the screws in on the other side. With the structural support for the lower shelf done, we're going to turn our attention to the top. And my daughter Sai is going to mark out the locations of the cross supports along the top in equal intervals all the way across. Since she pulled all of the measurements from the left side of the table for the front half, she's also got to pull all the measurements from the left side of the table on the back half, so they line up the same. The narrow strips that were left over after cutting the rails in half for the upper part of the table were basically cut into pieces, and that's what we're using for our braces to go across the top. Once she gets that brace put in place, she can use a clamp to squeeze and hold everything together, and then she can pre-drill and insert a screw. 2 screws isn't really required here. We're going to have a number of braces across the top, and we don't want to take a chance on splitting anything, so we're just going to put 1 screw in each of these. Now she can just move down the row and insert the rest of the braces pretty much the same way. Once the front row was done, she just flipped the table around and is putting all the screws into the backside now. The only critical thing here is to make sure that each of these braces is lined up perfectly flush with that top rail. So there we have it, the completed structure and framework for this workbench. If we wanted at this point, we could just throw a piece of plywood on top and we'd have a perfectly serviceable bench. But let's go ahead and cut the parts for the drawers and the shelf down below. So my buddy Mike bought all of the materials for this project, and at the big box store he saw this birch plywood and really liked it. So he decided to buy this. It takes 2 full sheets of plywood to do this whole bench, and that includes the top, the shelf down below, and the boxes, the drawers, and everything. So all the plywood necessary comes to two whole sheets. I think he said this stuff was about $50 a sheet, but you could just use a sanded pine plywood that comes in at about $32 a sheet if you like, and save a little bit of money there. So here we're cross-cutting the edge of this board to be square, and I put some painter's tape down first, and what that does is that prevents the fibers from the edge of the board from tearing up, so I have a nice clean finish. Squaring these is very, very easy if you have one of these circular saw edge guides, which is a self-clamping guide. In this case I have one that's manufactured by Bora, and I'll have a link to that in the description. And I also showed sort of how to use this in my video on hand tools. The board we're dealing with here is the board that is the lower shelf. So I need to cut little squares out of each of the corners to get the shelf to fit around the 4x4s. You can see carefully my saw blade is going just to the inside of that line, and I'm using my left hand held tightly to the board to guide the fence on the left side of my circular saw, so I keep a nice straight cut. In order to get a clean corner, I stop right at the corner with the table saw and then follow that up with either a hand saw or the jigsaw right up to the corner itself to get a nice clean cut. As it turns out, we had to pull one of the braces out in order to get this in because the table itself is just a little bit too small for us to get it in any other way. But we can just put that top brace right back in as soon as we're done. And that would be the bottom shelf. Now we are going to be cutting down some plywood to make the boxes that are going to hold the drawers. There are countless ways to put drawers in, but the method I'm going to show you here is really by far the easiest. We're just essentially going to create some rectangular boxes and then suspend them or mount them right underneath the top of the table, and the drawers are going to slide in and out of these boxes. I mentioned that the project took 2 sheets of ply, and it might have been possible to get away with one sheet of ply that was 3/4 of an inch thick and another sheet of ply that was a 1/2 inch thick, but it was really just easier to buy everything in 3/4 inch stock, and that way we could use all of the small pieces for anything. 3/4 of an inch is really overkill for drawers. It doesn't have to be that stout, but there's no harm in having it 3/4 of an inch. And in this birch plywood that was for sale at the big box store, I think the price difference was about $5. It was only $5 cheaper to go down to a 1/2 inch ply. So in this case, it was easier just to get 2 sheets of 3/4. Okay, so this is the first of 2 boxes that we're going to make. These are rectangular boxes that are going to hold the drawers. The drawers are going to slide in and out of these boxes, and we're going to put them together just by screwing them together. I'm using a deck screw here, and I'll put a link to these in the description below. First, I want to show you this little jig that I made. This is a little jig that's got a 3/8 inch by 3/8 inch notch in it, and that notch essentially gets us halfway to the middle of a 3/4 inch thick sheet of ply. So if I run it down the edge like this and draw a pencil line, I have a mark now exactly halfway down the edge of that middle piece of plywood. So I don't have to guess. We can essentially use that line as the mark where we're going to drill our holes and put our screws, and we can be confident that our screws are going to go right into the middle. It's just a real quick and easy way to mark. So here you can see this box coming together. Basically, this is a box that's going to hold the drawer. The drawer itself is going to slide in and out of the box, and we're going to mount this box onto the workbench just underneath the top. So drawer slides are going to have to be mounted inside of this box, and if we were smart, we would have went ahead and mounted those drawer slides on the inside before putting the box fully together. We didn't, so on the second one here, I'm going to show you how to mount these first. I've got a couple of spacers that I'm going to put down in order to make sure that this drawer slide is parallel and the exact same distance up off of each edge. From this perspective, the right side of the drawer slide is the back of the drawer slide. So it looks like it's not going, all the way back to the back edge of the box, which is no problem. But the front of the drawer slide is critical, and we'll see that when we do the other end. But the front of the drawer slide is lined up to be about a 1/16 of an inch back from the edge. So we basically have opened the slide, and we're going to pre-drill with the VIX bit. The VIX bit is what's on the drill here. This is a self-centering bit. It'll make sure that the hole goes right to the dead center. And then we'll simply insert these small screws, and we'll put those in all the way along the edge of the drawer slide. Now that we've flipped it over to the other side, the front part of the drawer slide is on the right, and we'll see we're going to recess that back somewhere between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch from the front. There's the top and there's the bottom. Once we're happy with the position, we'll pull the drawer slide out of the way, and we'll just repeat the same procedure. We'll use the VIX bit, the self-centering bit. We'll pre-drill our holes, and then we'll put the screws in. It takes about 5 screws to achieve the 100-pound rating for this pair of ball-bearing drawer slides. And I'll have a link to these drawer slides in the description below. These drawer slides are pretty inexpensive on Amazon. Okay, we're going to put this one back together and carry these 2 boxes over to the bench. At this point, now I can tell you why I made the rails on the top narrower. I didn't want a full 2x4 because I didn't want these drawers getting low enough where they might be uncomfortable to reach into and open. So I chose to have these rails to be about 2 inches wide instead of the full 3.5 inches wide, so we didn't have to reach down so low to get into the drawers. So we're going to hold this in place. We're going to loosely clamp it. And then Maya's going to clamp the back, and then she's going to tap it into exact position so it's flush with the front. With that one held in place, Mike and Maya are going to put the second one in place. And we've basically designed them so that they fit snug from side to side. And you can also see why we don't necessarily need a thick rail across the top, because these are actually going to end up providing quite a bit of support to the structure themselves. Now it is time to pre-drill and fasten these to the 4x4s. I'm going to use a 2-inch screw to go through these sidewalls into the 4x4 to get a little more strength out of it. Next, I'm going to use 6 or 8 of these GRK cabinet screws to hold the 2 boxes together. These cabinet screws do not have to have holes that are pre-drilled. They have a pan head at the top, and they are 1.25 inches long. They're actually designed to put 2 pieces of plywood together flat. And finally, we'll finish off the screws into the other leg on the other side of the table. And because I like to have things that are overbuilt just a little bit, I'm going to run a row of cabinet screws up through the top. I have this right angle drill attachment, which I'll put a link to this in the description. A lot of times in woodworking we have to get into areas that are just too small to get our drill in to work, and this right angle attachment makes it really easy to do. Now we're going to measure for drawers, and I want to say something about that. Even if you have plans, I never advise to cut drawers out until after the boxes for the drawers are built. Somewhere along the way, you might have made a very small error, and in which case none of your drawers are going to fit if you've already pre-cut and pre-made them. Drawers should be measured and cut last always. I'm going to show you exactly how I do it. I've measured the opening, the drawer box opening, at 19 and 7/16 of an inch. I know my drawer can't be 19 and 7/16 of an inch wide because I have to subtract some thickness for my drawer slides. The drawer slides that I've purchased are exactly 1/2 inch wide each, and you must know this. You have to find this out from your manufacturer. So I'm going to subtract 1 inch total. That's going to leave me with 18 and 7/16. So 18 and 7/16 is going to be the actual outer dimensions of my drawer box. My drawer box consists of 5 pieces, basically the 2 sides, the front, the back, and the bottom. Here I'm sketching in the sides. I'm going to kind of show you a detailed sketch to show you how I come up with the measurements that I need. Okay, so this is spatially oriented so that this is going to be the front and this is going to be the back. This is going to be the side, and then opposed from that is the other side. So now if I take a look at just the front without putting this whole image in a 3D perspective, I will see the two sides on either side of the front. These are the sides that I'm marking here, and that's represented by these. Those are the sides. This is the material my sides are made of. So I've got to shrink the front by this thickness in order to get the correct measurement for the front. So the two of these together are 1.5 inches. So I'll need to subtract 1.5 inches from what I want the total size of my drawer body to be. Now you remember that my total size is 18 7/16 of an inch. That's outside to outside, and it includes the sides. Now I need to know the dimension between the sides, and that is 18 7/16 minus the 1.5 inches for the two sides. That leaves me with 16 15/16. That's the dimension here, the dimension of the front. And that's the critical dimension, and that's the one that we'll need to cut our front and our back. They have to be identical. Now my plans may or may not have called for that exact dimension, but it doesn't matter. I'm not going to cut my drawers until I have my drawer openings done. Remember that. Don't cut your drawers until you have your drawer openings done. After I cut it, I've also checked it with the measuring tape to make sure it's right. And there's my two fronts and two backs for both drawer bodies. There are many ways that I could put these drawers together. I have decided to use a pocket hole jig. This is a Craig pocket hole jig, and it's one of my favorite tools. And you can see I've marked 3 lines on the board where I want these holes to go. So I simply line them up and drill the first hole. I'll unclamp the jig, I'll move it over to the next slot, and I'll drill this one. Now every woodworker has an opinion on pocket holes, and I'm going to give you mine. I think pocket holes are fantastic. They're great for shop projects or things you're going to put together for your garage or your basement, things like that. I don't think I would use pocket holes to build a jewelry box out of exotic wood, but they certainly do have their place in woodworking. I think they get a bad rap by a lot of woodworkers who think that they're cheating or an easy way out, and that just isn't true. Anything that you can do to achieve your woodworking goals to make the projects you need to make is perfectly fine. So while the pocket holes are getting finished up, we're going to jump on to the next step. For the next step, we're going to take a piece of this plywood, rip it, and we're going to cover up the back opening of those boxes that we stuck underneath the table. And you can see hopefully there that we've traced around the location where those boxes belong, and we're going to pre-drill a series of holes and just securely mount this board to those boxes and to the 4x4 legs as well. This particular board is going to give us a lot of rack resistance. This is kind of the main strength piece that's going to make this a strong table. This piece also serves to give those thin rails that are at the top a considerable amount of additional strength. So we could certainly now stand on the tabletop or put heavy gear on it without any fear of it sagging in the future. And maybe it's overkill on screws a little bit, but when I buy them by the big bucket, I think they end up being about $0.015 a screw. So I'm not really too concerned if we spend an extra 15 or 20 cents to make the strongest project that we can make. Well, that'll do it for this half. I hope you can come back for part 2 to see the rest of the project. Thanks for watching.